The prone leg curl is another great hamstring exercise. Before we start this one, I'm going to apologise because for Chris this is going to be a little awkward to film because I'm going to be diving down and then coming back up, and then I'm going to get her to try and walk around. There's a pillar in the way of this one, just so we can see what's happening a little bit more at the knee. So I'm going to try and explain as much up here as we can, but we will get around so you can see what's happening at the ankle and at the knee joint from a slightly different angle. Whenever we're setting up the prone leg curl or a leg extension, this pivot point here is what I'm going to try and line my knee up with, okay? So when we do extensions and extend the leg, or when we curl back, knee flexion and extension, we want the bit that it moves around to be in line with the knee joint. So when I lie down on here, I'm trying to lie down in such a way that my knee is in a direct line with the part of the machine that this actually moves around. From here, I'm just settling myself in. The pad above my ankle is going to sit just below my calf, just above my Achilles. Depending on the type of machine that you've got, as you curl this up, it might move around a little bit. So sometimes we're finding kind of best case scenario, it's not always perfect. We'll get to that in a second. The main bit is what's going to happen here. I'm going to keep my low back as still as I possibly can so that my hamstring can shorten against my pelvis position. So once I'm locked in here, I'm going to squeeze this back, and I'm trying to keep this as still as it can be. It'll move slightly because it has to brace and stabilize while my knee is flexing back against it. But what we shouldn't be seeing is something a bit more like kind of this, where we get much more spinal flexion and extension going on in there. The spine doesn't need to change position. We're going to keep that locked into place and then shorten against it. Chris now comes around the side there. We're then going to take a look at the ankle and what's happening around here. When I'm in this position, I can either point my toes up towards my shin, or I can point them away. We call this position plantar flexed and this position dorsi flexed. When I go into a plantar flex position, I actually shorten my calf muscle. Now the top calf muscle, gastrocnemius, actually helps flex the knee, but it can't flex the knee when it's shortening in its other function, which is pointing the toes down. So if I point the toes down as I go through my calf raise, I take away gastroc's ability to help out during the movement, and I turn this a little bit more into a hamstring exercise. There is a little bit of controversy with this because there is some debate that it might cause more strain on the knee, and some people just don't like the sensation that it gives them. If that's the case, we just pull into a dorsiflex position and we go through the same exact thing. Personally, for example, I tend to actually do this with a dorsiflexed foot position. I prefer the sensation that it gives me as I go through. But the main bit, either way, whichever way we do this, is that the foot stays in the same position throughout. If we go into plantar flexion, we stay in plantar flexion throughout. If we're in dorsiflexion, we stay in dorsiflexion throughout. So there shouldn't be any foot change of position within that. The final thing we can then think a little bit about is where we rotate the legs to. So if I turn my feet out a little bit and I go through the same movement, so I do it kind of in this somewhat position, I get a little bit more of the outside of the hamstring, what we call the lateral hamstrings. If I do the opposite and turn them in a little bit, I get a little bit more internal hamstring. Generally speaking though, we don't need to go into that level of detail for stuff, and the feet are going to stay quite fixed forward. So unless you've got a good reason to want to really attack your lateral or your internal hamstrings, keep them kind of straight, and then we can at least hit all of them relatively evenly. And that is the prone leg curl.